Hello there, I'm Stuart Holman. Welcome to another week of Daily Devotionals, this week in the book of Daniel. In our journey through the narrative of the Bible, we're up to the period of Israel's exile in Babylon. And to make sense of Daniel and its lions, dens and fiery furnaces, magic writing and scary, bad kings who are actually made to look quite foolish, to make sense of all of this, we need to read the book of Daniel in its historical context and be aware of its sophisticated structure. And the opening two verses set the scene for us. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So Jerusalem has been surrounded, strangled of life, and then defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. Tellingly, it is the Lord himself who delivered Israel's king into the Babylonians' hands, as well as the articles from the temple. Imagine for a moment the Babylonian soldiers storming into the Holy of Holies, that place of God's presence that the high priest would only dare enter once a year and only then after extensive sacrifices and purification. But now, with God himself handing it over, here come the Gentile soldiers, blaspheming, defiling, pillaging and destroying Israel's most sacred place. And they're absolutely safe, because God has already left the building, as recorded by the prophet Ezekiel in chapters 10 and 11 of his book. So what's the message here? I'm sure the Babylonians would say, well, look, our gods have defeated your Jewish God. Your holy trinkets have no power. Your God has failed you. Our God has captured your God. Your entire temple and its system of worship with sacrifices and priests and songs, it's over. Then Israel's king, his family, and the brightest and best of Jerusalem, they're chained up as slaves and they're carried off to Babylon. Among them are Daniel and 3 of his friends. And so the book of Daniel begins tragically as one of the lowest points of Israel's history. But from there, as the narrative unfolds, we start to see that God is still in control. His power is undiminished. His fame and his glory are being established now even over Babylon. And really, I think it's the main idea of the book. Even in apparent defeat, God's rule over all is assured. He is establishing his kingdom, even in weakness, even when it looks like everything has gone wrong. I think that's the big picture. And I think that this is supported by the book's very sophisticated literary structure, marked by 2 different languages. Broadly speaking, chapter 1 is written in Hebrew, just like the rest of the Old Testament, but then chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, which became the common language of the Jewish exiles in Babylon. But then, after the middle 6 chapters, the book of Daniel returns to Hebrew. Interestingly, when we group the chapters this way, quite a few links and connections show up. Chapter 1 serves as something of an introduction to life in Babylon. We see how bad things are, and yet Daniel and his friends stay loyal to God. They entrust themselves to his power. As I've already said, this introduces the main theme, where despite persecution, the victory belongs to God. And so with this introduction then begins the central section of the book. In chapter 2, the king has a dream, which Daniel interprets. Chapter 3, we see a miraculous deliverance from the fiery furnace for Daniel's 3 friends. Chapter 4, we have the story of King Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his humiliation, and his restoration. In chapter 5, we start to notice the interesting patterns emerging, because the story of Belshazzar's pride seems to mirror the previous chapter with Nebuchadnezzar. They're a pair. And then in chapter 6, we have Daniel's miraculous deliverance from the lion's den, with similarities to the fiery furnace narrative. And then in chapter 7, Daniel has a dream, which is perhaps the high point of the book, the launch point for the final section of the book in Hebrew, which goes on to deal with future kings and empires. And so in chapter 8 we have Daniel's second vision, then chapter 9 we have Daniel's prayer for deliverance, and then finally in chapters 10 through 12 a series of visions and dreams that relate to the period of history from the Babylonian Empire through the Medes and the Persians to the Greek and Roman empires. So there's a clear structure in the book with this central section speaking of God's complete sovereignty even when evil seems to rule. And this gives readers confidence and hope for the future. God's anointed king will surely come and his everlasting kingdom will surely be established. So there's the book of Daniel in a nutshell, and it's all about the victory of God and his rule over all nations, not just Israel, but every nation on earth, big and small. And so this is the theme that we see introduced in chapter 1. I won't read all of chapter 1 out in detail. You can do that for yourself if you wish. But when Daniel and his three friends arrive in Babylon, they're put into training in Nebuchadnezzar's palace so that they will serve in his court. They're stripped of their Jewish names, each of which, by the way, in some way celebrates the greatness of Yahweh. And instead they're given new Babylonian names. They are given a Babylonian education and they are immersed in Babylonian culture and customs and food. And the intent is clear. They want to turn them into happy little Babylonians. But in the face of this, Daniel and his friends request to only eat vegetables instead of all the defiled food served up at the king's table. Now, it's not a vegan revolution as such. It's not really about the food per se. Their actions are an expression of faith in Yahweh, the living God of Israel. And at the end of a trial 10-day period, we read this. Daniel and his friends looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, Daniel and his 3 mates, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. So the Babylonian assimilation project fails for Daniel and his friends. Moreover, we're given encouragement and guidance as to the way we should live in our culture. Our culture, which also works so hard to undermine our faith in God and to woo us into passive acceptance of a world and a worldview that is bereft of God. I think the first clue as to how we should respond in such a situation is how the name Daniel endures. Although the Babylonians gave him a new name of Belteshazzar, which means Prince of Baal, everyone remembers him as Daniel, which means God is my judge. Daniel will live his life before God alone, not caring for anyone else's opinion or judgment of him. No, God is his judge. This same conviction will serve us well in our culture. You see, our lives are also played out before an audience of one. God is our judge, not the public opinion polls, not the Facebook gossip, not the boss, the club president, or your best friend. We are accountable to God alone for the way we live in these days, difficult days they be. He is our judge. His opinion of us and our actions are the only ones that ultimately matter, you see. Another clue as to how we might live in our culture, which is so set against God, is the way that Daniel trained his appetite to please God, to show himself devoted to him. Once again, not so much about the vegetables per se, but we can also train our appetites to show our devotion to God. We train the appetites of our mind and our soul. So, for example, what do we feed our minds on an average day? A Babylonian diet of the mind and soul has no reference to the living God. While we might need to live and work in a Babylonian world, we also feed our hearts and souls and minds with God's word and his ways. Throughout the book of Daniel, we'll continue to reflect on life in exile, recognizing that our own lives face many similar pressures to those of the Babylonian exile. We live in the world, but we are not of the world. And so may this day find you anchored in God and not in the culture in which we live. May that be the springboard for your prayers this day.